It began with a flicker, a single point of light on a monitoring screen in a darkened observatory, blinking once, then twice, then holding steady. Dr. Mira Chen almost missed it. She had been staring at the same feed for 6 hours, waiting for something that statistically should not exist, and when it finally appeared, her first instinct was to assume the sensor was malfunctioning again. It was not malfunctioning. Something was moving through the outer edge of the solar system, and it was moving in a way that nothing natural was supposed to move. She called it in at 2 in the morning, her voice too calm for what she was reporting. Command Center wanted confirmation. Confirmation came within the hour, from 3 separate observatories on 3 separate continents, and by dawn, the object had a name, a number, a letter, a string of characters that would mean nothing to anyone outside the small circle of scientists who now could not sleep. They called it Object 7. It was not the 7th thing they had found from beyond the solar system. It was the first. But someone in the control room had a dark sense of humor, and the number stuck before anyone thought to stop it. What made Object 7 different was not that it was there. Rocks passed through the solar system constantly. Tumbling debris left over from the birth of stars, indifferent and silent. What made Object 7 different was its shape. Long, impossibly long for its width, like a needle drawn out of the dark, spinning end over end in a rhythm too steady to be random. And it was accelerating. Not falling toward the sun the way any comet would, pulled by gravity and nothing more. It was gaining speed in a direction gravity could not explain. A small but undeniable push, as though some invisible hand were nudging it forward. Dr. Chen sat in the observation room with the printouts in her lap, and for the first time in her career, she felt something colder than curiosity. She felt watched. The team assembled quickly: astrophysicists, propulsion engineers, a materials scientist pulled from an unrelated project, and a quiet man named Dorian Voss, who introduced himself only as a consultant and never explained who he consulted for. He arrived within 36 hours of the discovery, which was itself impossible, given that the discovery had not yet been made public. Nobody asked how he knew. Nobody in that room, it turned out, wanted to know the answer. Voss set a single folder on the table. Inside were images that did not match anything on the public feed. Sharper, closer. Taken, he said, from an asset already in position, an asset none of them had clearance to ask about. The images showed a surface unlike ice, unlike stone, facets, straight edges, catching starlight at angles too clean to be erosion. "It isn't a rock," Voss said. "You already know that. What you don't know is that this isn't the first time we've seen something like it." The room went still. "There was another," he continued. "Years ago. Smaller. Slower. It came. It was studied for 11 days. And then it accelerated out of range faster than anything we could follow. We called it an anomaly and buried the file. We assumed it was alone. Mira found her voice first, and now there's a second one." "Now there's a second one," Voss agreed, "which means it was never an anomaly. It was a pattern. And patterns have origins." Over the following weeks, the team worked in shifts around the clock, running every instrument they had access to against Object 7's surface, its spin, its trajectory, its faint and stubborn thermal signature. The official public narrative, fed carefully to press outlets, described a fascinating but explainable interstellar rock elongated by tidal stresses, its strange acceleration attributed to outgassing too faint to visually detect. Inside the lab, nobody believed that story. They simply had nothing better to offer the world yet, and some truths, Voss argued, needed time before they could be spoken without causing panic. The spectral data alone was enough to keep Mira awake most nights. The reflected light carried signatures that resembled refined metal more than raw ore, arranged not randomly but in bands, as if layered deliberately during construction rather than formed by the slow chaos of a planet's original crust. "Layered," said Dr. Amaru Osei, the materials scientist, tapping the readout, "which means somebody built this in stages, on purpose. This isn't a natural formation event, this is engineering." "Or a very convincing coincidence," Mira offered, "more out of habit than belief. Osei shook his head slowly. I've spent 20 years studying how rock forms. This isn't a coincidence. I don't know what it is, but it isn't that. The spin was the next piece to break the illusion of randomness. Every few hours, the object's rotation paused almost imperceptibly, then resumed at a fractionally different rate, as if something inside were making small corrections. Natural bodies tumble. They do not correct themselves. By the fourth week, the team had stopped debating whether Object 7 was artificial. The only question left in the room was who had made it, and why it had waited until now to come close enough to be seen. The first real answer came not from a telescope, but from an accident. A junior engineer named Petra Ilyanova had been assigned the tedious task of running Object 7's trajectory, backward through every known gravitational model, tracing where it had been for the last several thousand years before it entered detectable range. It was meant to be a formality, a box to check for the final report. Instead, it produced something that made her drop her coffee. The backward trajectory did not simply trail off into open interstellar space, the way a random wanderer should. It curved, gently, almost gracefully, in a long arc that connected improbably with the last recorded position of the first anomaly, the one from years earlier, the one they had assumed was alone. Two objects, two arrivals, years apart. And when she extended the arc forward instead of backward, it did not end at Object 7's current position. It kept going. There was a third point on the curve, still years away, still approaching, patient and unhurried, exactly where a slow and deliberate visit would place it if something intended to arrive, observe, and then arrive again. Petra brought the printout to Voss without a word. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said the only thing that mattered. "They're not passing through," he said quietly. "They're returning." Before the split came, there was a quieter moment, one Mira would return to often in the months that followed. It happened 2 nights after Petra's discovery, when most of the building had emptied out and only a handful of lights still burned on the upper floor. Mira found Osei alone in the materials lab, running the same simulation for the 11th time, as if repetition might change the outcome. On the screen, a rotating model of Object 7 turned slowly, its faceted surface catching simulated starlight, the way the real object caught the real thing, millions of miles away. "You don't believe the pattern," she said, not quite a question. Osei didn't look up. "I believe the pattern. I don't believe we're ready for what it means." He paused the rotation, freezing the object mid-turn. 20 years of my life I've studied how the universe builds things without intention. Gravity pulling dust into planets, pressure turning carbon into diamond. No one deciding anything, just physics doing what physics does. And now I'm looking at something that behaves like it was decided. Decided by what though? Mira said. That's the part I can't stop turning over. Not who. What? We keep saying builders, engineers, senders, like we already know there's a mind behind this. What if there isn't? What if it's a process we don't have a word for yet? Something between natural and design that we've just never had the chance to observe before now. Osei considered that for a long moment. I'd almost prefer that, he admitted. A process is something you can study without it looking back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the pulse from the first object had not looked like a process. It had looked like a greeting. It was that unspoken thought, more than any single piece of data, that finally forced the disagreement into the open. 2 days later, when Voss called the full team together and laid both folders on the table at once. The revelation split the team in two. Some argued for silence. Bury the trajectory data the way the first anomaly had been buried. Wait, watch. Learn everything possible before the public or anyone else understood what was coming. Osei was among them. We don't even know what we're looking at, he said. Announcing a pattern like this before we understand it isn't caution, it's chaos. Others argued the opposite. Mira was among them. If something built this and sent it here on purpose, she said, hiding that fact doesn't protect anyone. It just means the first real contact humanity has with it happens in secret, decided by a handful of people in a room, instead of by anyone with a right to know. Voss said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had made this exact decision before, and lived with what came after. The first object, he said, did something before it left detectable range. A single pulse, structured, not random noise, not a malfunction. We never released that either. He looked at each of them in turn. We've been sitting on evidence of contact for years, telling ourselves we were being careful. I am done deciding that alone. He placed a second folder on the table. Inside was the pulse data, translated crudely into a waveform, and beneath it, a note scrawled by the analyst who had first decoded its structure all those years ago. 4 words, nothing more, not a warning, an introduction. In the weeks that followed, the argument never fully resolved. Instead, it settled into an uneasy compromise. The kind institutions reach when no one has the authority to force a decision and no one has the courage to make one alone. The trajectory data would stay contained within the team for now. The pulse recording would not. Voss argued, and eventually won, that at minimum the wider scientific community deserved to study the signal itself, stripped of speculation, presented simply as an unexplained recorded event worth independent analysis. It was released quietly, without fanfare, buried in a technical bulletin that only specialists would think to read. Within 72 hours, 3 independent labs on 3 continents had reproduced the analysis and reached the same conclusion the original team had reached years earlier, and never spoken aloud. The structure was not noise. The probability of it occurring naturally was vanishingly small. The response from the broader scientific community was not panic. It was something quieter and in its own way more unsettling. Careful, methodical curiosity. The sound of hundreds of researchers quietly reorganizing their life's work around a single new possibility. Grant proposals shifted overnight. Telescope time that had been booked years in advance for unrelated projects was suddenly, urgently reallocated. Mira spent those weeks fielding calls from colleagues she hadn't spoken to in a decade, all of them asking some version of the same question. Is it real? Is it actually real? And each time she found herself giving the same careful answer Voss had given the team on the first day. We don't know what it is. We know it isn't random. Petra, meanwhile, had not stopped refining her trajectory model. If anything, the pressure of the wider world's attention sharpened her focus rather than distracting from it. She isolated a third data point on the long curving arc, then a fourth, faint but present in older archival sky surveys nobody had thought to re-examine before. Each new point strengthened the same unsettling conclusion. This was not a single visit. It was the latest entry in a sequence that had been running quietly for far longer than anyone in that room had been alive. How far back does it go? Ose asked her during one of the late night sessions that had become the team's new normal. Petra hesitated before answering. As far back as our records exist, she said. I just don't think we were looking in the right way to notice it before now. That answer sat with the room longer than any of them expected. If the pattern predated modern astronomy, predated the instruments capable of properly resolving it, then whatever was moving through that long, patient arc had been arriving and leaving and arriving again, since long before anyone on Earth had the tools to say hello back. The thought did not comfort anyone, but it did settle something in Mira that had been unsettled since that first flickering blip on her monitor. This was not a threat racing toward them out of nowhere. It was a rhythm, ancient and unhurried, and for the first time in that rhythm's long history, someone on the receiving end was finally paying attention. Object 7 made its closest approach on a clear night in early autumn, sweeping past at a distance still vast by any ordinary measure, close enough for every major instrument on the planet to have a clear, unbroken view. Mira stood in the observation room with the rest of the team, watching the live feed in silence, the way people watch something they know they will remember for the rest of their lives. At the moment of closest approach, the object's faint thermal signature brightened, briefly, deliberately, in a pattern that repeated 3 times before fading back to its baseline glow. It was not an accident of physics. It was a signal offered freely to anyone paying close enough attention to notice. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody needed to. Object 7 continued on its long, curving path back out into the dark, unhurried, patient, exactly as Petra's trajectory model had predicted. It would be years before its return. Years the team would spend preparing, arguing, and slowly, carefully, deciding how much of what they now knew the rest of the world deserved to hear. Mira looked at the fading signal on the screen, and for the first time since that first flicker on her monitor, the cold feeling of being watched had changed into something else. Not fear exactly, something closer to anticipation. Because whatever built Object 7, whoever sent it drifting through the dark for thousands of years just to pause, observe, and leave again, had done something no natural process ever could. It had chosen to be found, and somewhere out past the edge of everything humanity could yet reach, it was already on its way back.